Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for our SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, March 23rd, 2022, and today we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators this past week. First up, what's the difference between the Global North and the Global South in international ed terms? Second, does the United States have a value gap with international students? And third, are 40% of international students not returning to Australia and going elsewhere? We'll answer these 3 questions and more today on the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. As we do each week, we take our news stories that we present on Monday in our newsletter called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and we take a look at those common themes we see developing in the news stories, and we present the 3 questions we cover here on Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on our Facebook Live for SMIE Consulting. And each week we take these news stories and we encourage you to subscribe to the newsletter. I'm putting the link to the most recent edition of the newsletter as well as the page on our SMIE Consulting website where you can subscribe officially to the newsletter and get these news stories in your inbox each Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. So let's dive right into our first question of the day. And this is one of the big thinking questions that we have every once in a while on the news here for the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. And this one is comes out of a University World News article entitled "Higher Education Report Charts the Rise of the Global South." This is put together by my good friend and colleague Alex Usher from Higher Education Strategy Associates out of Toronto. They do some amazing work on the Canadian higher ed, but also larger international ed issues, and this report is a clear example of that. And for those not familiar, the terms that are talked about in the question here, Global North and Global South, referring to kind of the largely westernized countries of the world, industrialized countries of the world, and the Global South, kind of the less well-developed countries, but up-and-comers, and obviously South also has some geographical references to Southern Hemisphere, but also southern, south of the maybe GDP, some GDP lines. But clearly, there's a lot of institutions and countries that are in the Global South that are huge players economically, but on the world stage, but educationally haven't been necessarily. So Alex and his group have taken a look at trying to provide some perspective on the growth of education, higher education in particular, in the Global North versus the Global South, and looking at some comparative data on enrollments and funding, and some really great data points in here that I think is worth diving into a little bit more as we explore what really the differences are other than geographic between the Global North and South. So we're talking about just some basic numbers. We'll talk about the number of institutions that are involved here in the North and the South. We'll talk about funding, and we'll talk about what that funding typically goes to when there are increases and what that then creates in terms of a gap between the Global North and South. So great report, and there's going to be a webinar about this topic on the 31st, so a week from tomorrow. Certainly encourage you all. It's a University World News webinar, and that if you get the link to this article, you'll be able to get that webinar information coming up. So first off, the number of institutions. And one of the first data points that Alex and his team points out is the number of higher education institutions in the Global North, and talking U.S., Canada, Australia, UK, New Zealand, and mostly in Europe as well. There are approximately 20,000 higher education institutions, barely changed in a period between 2006 and 2018. The Global South, however, you saw their number double. They were already double the Global North in 2006. They moved from 40,000 to nearly 70,000 in 2018. So you've seen incredible growth in the number of institutions in higher education institutions in the Global South compared to the Global North, which has remained fairly flat. So we're looking at a global institutional total of 90,000 institutions of higher education around the world. Alex and his team do point out that most of that growth in the global south is from India, where, as anyone who's done any recruitment in India or gotten to understand the Indian subcontinent realizes that that colleges have exploded over the last 10, 15 years, where there may be a kind of a parent university or a parent university, and then maybe hundreds of colleges underneath them that are part of that umbrella of that institution in one way or another. But what that has also meant is that not nearly 90,000 institutions, you now see through those institutions, world student numbers overall have passed 200 million students are now enrolled in higher education. For some perspective, in the United States, we've been at about 18 to 20 million over the last decade or so. We're coming toward that demographic cliff, so we'll see what the numbers will do, but we've been 18, 19 million. So the U.S. is less than a tenth right now of the world higher education population. So 200 million worldwide currently enrolled. The number of students enrolled in global north institutions, in those 20,000 or so, peaked in 2011, according to this report, and have been going down since, to currently at about 58.3 million. So of the 200 million are enrolled in the global north institutions. However, in the global south, this is where the numbers are just mind-boggling. Their numbers have almost doubled in that same period between 2006 and 2018. They've gone from 78 million in 2006 to 150 million in 2018, so nearly double in that time period. So that what is apparent through these numbers that we're seeing is part of that growth is in the global south has been to accommodate growing college-age population and providing the spaces for higher education for students in those countries that are clamoring for it. The challenge has been not every and Alex's point in this article means that though this funding though the numbers have increased, the funding models, when they have increased in the global north versus the global south, operate on very different rationales. In terms of what they look at is the funding in that period between 2005, 6 and 2018 again, is that, as the article points out, when global north governments hike funding, it's for a stable body of students, and added money goes to quality, equity, and research, according to the article and the report. And in the global south, the money mostly goes to increased capacity and access. So this has obviously been the case in China. We saw a huge expansion in the mid-2000s to grow the number of institutions and the capacity at those institutions for enrolling students from their country, and in China's case, more students from overseas as well. But clearly the focus was on providing for the needs of their own populations who were clamoring for higher education opportunities. And those countries, India, China in particular, were seeing students leaving the country because they couldn't get, the top students were leaving the country because they couldn't get into their top choice institutions because there weren't enough spaces. You see that with top institutions in China, but you also see that in India, and that's been the case for 20 years or longer, where you've seen students who were trying to get into top institutions in India, have the IITs of the world, and didn't get places, started looking elsewhere for their higher education. Most of that to the U.S. didn't happen until graduate school, up until the last 10 years or so, when the undergraduate numbers started to rise. But you're certainly seen that in China. Those numbers have certainly took a dip the last 2 or 3 years, but maybe on the way back up in the coming 2 to 3 years itself. So great research coming out of Alex and his team at HESA. Very enlightening. And again, part of what we always talk about here on the Roundup as part of our 6 Ps of strategic international enrollment management is having that perspective on the world. What's going on in the rest of the world in terms of higher education? What are the push-pull factors in different countries, why students are considering overseas study options? So we take all of this information into account when we present these stories and try to provide an insight that you probably wouldn't have gotten if you're just head down and doing your job and going to those fairs and trying to enroll students each year. But this gives you some context. It's not going to help you increase your yield 10% every year, but it's certainly going to give you some perspective as you're talking to students, talking to parents, and understanding why you're recruiting in certain areas, what the motivations are going to be for students in those markets that might be looking to go overseas. So thanks to Alex and the team at HESA, and we'll certainly be talking more, I think, about this global north versus global south dichotomy. So let's move on to our second question of the day, and that is the one that I think is it's a survey that came out. The results of this survey came out last week. Got some attention in the Pi News. The article I'm presenting today is right off the news release for this report, this survey, I should say. This is the question: does the United States have a value gap with international students? So what are we talking about when we say value gap? Value gap is really, in this case, it's students value coming to the United States for the quality of education, but in terms of the results of this survey, but perhaps they don't see the immediate ROI in terms of the payoff for the return on their parents' investment for the degree that they've earned immediately. So they're more skeptical about that, I should say. The commission or the survey was commissioned by a company called Interstride, and not one I'm particularly familiar with. They also, as part of that research project, they contracted with Anna Asaki-Smith of Education Rethink to survey more than 1,000 students from over 100 countries. That was the goal of the survey. And her results were published in a paper, Is Studying in the U.S. Worth It? And her survey, she says, revealed a distinct dynamic. And I'll quote her here from the press release. "We have international students who value the U.S. study abroad experience, drawn to the country by the stellar reputation of U.S. colleges and universities," she said. "But what we offer in terms of tangible value to students through the lens of career outcomes is not as clear to these students." And a couple of the numbers that come out of this that are particularly illuminating, I think. 84% of respondents said they would recommend studying in the U.S. to friends and peers back home. This is good news for U.S. institutions, given the word-of-mouth marketing is a powerful recruitment tool for international students. But, quote here again, yet only 49% of respondents said that the value of a U.S. education from a career perspective justifies the cost. Now, that's 49%. We'll take a look at that a little bit more in depth. What I really like about this report is that her comment out of the report is that, and what she says higher education folks in the U.S. need to get their heads around is they must close the perceived value gap. And she identified some recommendations to do that. And some of these are ones we talk about, and certainly I've written about these for IDB Connect in terms of marketing out to prospective students and the things that they need to hear. And this is a lot of the results of this survey certainly back up a lot of what we've been hearing from other surveys or global surveys around the world, not just the U.S. ones, about the importance of outcomes, the importance of what is your degree going to lead me to when I'm done. And that's something that I think is critical in terms of connecting the dots on your campus. And this is something I struggle with almost every institution that I've ever done some work with on consulting on international education strategies is how well are you articulating your value that your career services provides to students, and in particular to international students. How well are you articulating that value to your prospective students? And there are often disconnects, unconnected dots that occur all over campuses where one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing in terms of the connection with international students. So that's why I always focus my attention when I start with a new campus is getting a sense of the landscape. Where are are the disconnects happening for international students, not just at the front end of the recruitment journey, but throughout their time on campus to the time that they become successful alumni. And that's ultimately what your campus is driving all students to be, is successful alumni. And if certainly universities are set up to do that for domestic students, and that's just the nature of the beast. Their career services offices have the job interview skills sessions. They have resume building activities. They have fairs that they do for internships and jobs, where they're bringing employers to campus, and they do a lot of great things for the majority of students. But when there are sets of international students that maybe don't have the same opportunities for internships and employment opportunities as from your college, because the career services aren't really attuned to those differences, those are disconnects that are happening. They oftentimes don't have the great data that they should have that demonstrates those outcomes. They may have most campuses will have students will be X percent of students who are employed within 6 months of graduation for those that are looking for jobs. Some go on to grad school. Some begin volunteering or take a gap year before they hit the work world, whatever it might be. But the data often isn't there to back it up. And what also is missing oftentimes are those success stories, particularly amongst young alumni. What have your degrees done over the last 5 to 10 years for young graduates from overseas that are now successful in their fields, whatever that might be. Tracking is always an issue. There are some social media tools, Handshake and others, that help you stay connected with alumni through some data mining that goes on, activities that go on, if you're not automatically tracking it yourself. But having that access to that data and having more specific outreach by career centers to international students, and that's one of the recommendations that is made through the survey, that there needs to, frankly, build upon the positive attitudes these international students have by coming to the United States, by providing both emotional and professional support. That's the second recommendation. And certainly during the pandemic, that's become more clear than ever, is the mental health challenges that everybody's had, not just international students, but they can be particularly acute amongst international students if they're coming from cultures where they never really talk about mental health. We barely talk about it here in the United States. It's become more accepted to do so recently, and perhaps domestic students, certainly I've read countless essays this past year from incoming applicants that talk about the toll the pandemic has had on their mental health. And at least they're talking about it. But international students, if they're not from a culture that values openness and talking about challenges that we have and experience in mental health, that can be a real struggle. So making sure that they're aware of the support that is available on campus to answer those kinds of questions, I think, is very valuable. And secondly, or the third recommendation, is to develop closer relationships with U.S. employers that could potentially hire international graduates. And I love this one because this is something I've implemented on a couple of campuses recently that I've worked with, and that's doing two things. Every campus has job fairs or internship fairs where employers come to campus and interview students. They're at a kind of college fair setting, and students can go around and visit with different employers. What I've had one of my institutions do is career service is when they have employers signing up. They're asking the question, will you hire international students who have legal permission to work for for between 1 and 3 years as at your company? Or will you hire them that way? So that if they answer no to that question, then when the students get the list of companies that are attending an event, only those that are have an asterisk by them will be ones that international students, when they get the list, will know, okay, these are the ones that I should focus my time and energy on, rather than spend in a room of 100 companies, only 25 will, for example, only 25 will hire international students for OPT. That's a service your career office can provide to international students to help them focus their time and energy effectively and not waste it. And How many times have you had international students, if you've been in touch with them, if you work with them as an advisor, when they come back after getting excited about a fair and then coming back, well, no one wants to hire international students. How depressing is that? But if they can go in focused with the ability of knowing, hey, there are companies here, these are the ones that say they can hire, I have these set of skills, they're looking for students, potential applicants with the same set of skills, then I'm going to focus my time on those companies. So by developing closer relationships with those employers, by doing more workshops for them in terms of what's involved to hire them, in terms of paperwork, there's nothing really that they need to do other than the STEM OPT folks, their supervisors need to be able to intelligently talk about how their extension time is going to be related to what they're doing is their STEM program, an extension of their STEM education. But having those employers be more engaged in, particularly those that do work with international students, to have them ready and willing to put that seed in their mind. Well, maybe we were missing out on students in case they don't hire currently international students. And I have a major company in my hometown here that's one of the largest petroleum companies in the country. They do not hire international students unless they already have permanent residency. And that is just eliminating some of the best STEM talent in their field because they won't hire an international student who they would have to take on OPT and then file and pay H-1B fees. They're not willing to do that because they see it as too risky. And that's something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, frankly, when you think about it. When the investment that they make in an international student can have lasting benefits far beyond just the time that they're that first initial 3 years or 1 year that you have them on an OPT contract. So developing those relationships with companies, even those that are just posting jobs on your site that they have available. Similarly, before you can post a job, one of the questions you answer is, will you hire international students on F1 visas for OPT? And so they will have that knowledge so that international students that are going to this an RSS feed for jobs on campus will now see, hey, they only hire they're willing to hire international students, so I'm going to focus on them. So that's just some great recommendations coming out of that survey, and I certainly wholeheartedly agree that these are things that U.S. colleges need to be including in how they talk about their institutions, but also on the back end, having the data and the connections that make sense and provide this level of service that international students need to make sure that when they leave your campus, they have the skill set, they have the opportunities, and they can be directed to those that make the most sense for them. So that's a great survey results, and certainly some recommendations there that make a whole lot of sense to me. And our final question of the day. This is going abroad. We're going down under here for this one. And it is, are 40% of international students not returning to Australia going elsewhere? So this, as you may know, Australia has recently reopened their doors to international students that are fully vaccinated to try and rebuild their international reputation. Certainly, Australia had, before the pandemic, had incredible student flows coming from China, coming from India, Nepal, Vietnam, other countries in South and East Asia that were really being attracted to Australian universities and the work opportunities that they would have. Pandemic hit, and as you know, outside of New Zealand and Japan and China, Australia shut down almost completely. And for international students who weren't already in the country in March of 2020, they were left out. They weren't able to get back in until just in the last few months. And so only slowly through some pilot programs in 2021, and now the doors are open to those that are fully vaccinated. So the initial returns have certainly been positive. There's been some news stories we've been seeing that are suggesting that some areas of the country are super satisfied or super happy with their results in terms of student returns. But some of the data is perhaps a little little worrying in the long term for Australia. And this is something that Australian universities certainly have been counting on, this reopening to reinvigorate their student populations. And this is important because when you think about Australian universities, they were already at 25 to 30% international to begin with. When you have up to almost 30% of your population, student population, shut out. For those that were, what percentage of that weren't in the country when the academic year began? You now have the hope that these students that have been abroad for better part of 2 years are now able to come back in the country because they're fully vaccinated. Some are coming in the final semester or final term to graduate, be able to graduate soon, and then begin their post-study work. And that's one of the things that all the countries that really shut down have allowed students who are continuing to pursue their degrees online to maintain their clock, if you will, towards being able to keep their post-study work dreams alive. So that one company that's looked into this, there's some new research commissioned by online study support service called Studiosity out of Australia and conducted by an independent research agency called the Student Edge, has indicated that only half, a little over half, 58% of international students enrolled at Australian universities plan on returning to campus this year. Wow. So less than 60% of international students that have been enrolled at Australian universities virtually were planning to return to campus this year. So roughly 40%, 41% are going to be studying elsewhere. And that is potentially significant. Oh my goodness, what is going on in the wide world? Well, how are 40%? And the way this is worded, it's not quite clear because it does say 58% of international students enrolled at Australian universities plan on returning to campus this year. Of the students not returning to campus in Australia, so that would be the 42%, 2 in 5 will be studying elsewhere. So that means the other 1% are going to finish their degrees online, apparently. So this research also indicates that those that were studying abroad, online basically, 8 in 10 international students felt lonely, or I should say this is the during the time of those students that stayed in the country, stayed in Australia, 8 in 10 international students felt lonely or homesick. And that made up of 50% who felt isolated from friends and family back home, makes sense, and 28% who found it difficult to make new friends. But in positive news, and again from the article, for those students, there are a few key changes that are simple to implement and could help others feel less alone. More networking events for international students, 42% said that they would welcome those. Additional peer support programs, 33% said that they would welcome those. And a buddy system to help them transition into university life in Australia. That's for those students that are coming back in. So this international student well-being, I think even before the pandemic, was already kind of ratcheting up on the priority issues level for a lot of institutions around the world, just in terms of the increased stress and strain of travel and study abroad and expectations and all of that. And this gets back to what we're talking about with in the U.S. about the focus on mental health issues that we've seen as a result of the pandemic. A lot more students impacted, and certainly these survey results suggested those that stayed in country certainly felt lonely or homesick, and that often led to periods of long isolation and disconnectedness, and then that starts to play on your mind after a while. Not anybody, not just international students. So it's seeing a lot of those issues really come to the fore, and I think that's refreshing. That institutions, colleges, governments are now starting to see that there's some real value in developing the levels of services that these students need to help manage those transitions better, particularly those who are coming back. So really interesting data point, and I'm surprised they don't go into it more here with 40% of Australian and international students that were outside the country during the pandemic have decided not to enroll and are going to study elsewhere. That's significant, and we'll wait to see what the actual numbers are. But that student survey results do seem to lay some worrying troubles at the doors of Australian institutions. So we'll certainly keep our eyes on that one. But that's all we have for you this week on the Midweek Roundup. I do appreciate you being a part of the conversation, as always, and we look forward to continuing our chats with you at upcoming conferences as we get into conference season here more in depth in the next 3 to 4 months. So until next time, we wish you all the very best. Cheers.